how are you all keeping? Last week in a rather lengthy video I took a look at some sculpting tools that I use, and this week we're going to have a bit of a shorter video, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the mediums, some of the clays, some of the putties. Now you may notice it's a bit boomy, a bit echoey here. I've come to a different location in the house. This is the stairwell that leads up to my studio. My studio's up the top, so it's got some nice Velux windows, lots of natural light. You'll have seen the videos of me of me up there, and my wife's studio is also upstairs as well. And on the approach, I've just put up these framed pictures here. This is some of the artwork from the woods that Matthew Street very kindly sent us. So really nice black and white line art. I've got another piece to go here, but the place that I got the frames from only had one in this size, and I need another one, but portrait, to go on this wall here. So that's not quite finished, but that's why we're in a slightly boomy, echoey, dingy corner of the house. Although you can show off the artwork, so the lighting's not too bad, but it probably doesn't come across that well on camera. Because I wanted to show you our nice Matthew Street gallery, so thank you, Matthew. When it comes to mediums for sculpting, I'm going to talk about three groups of mediums. I'm going to talk about traditional clays, polymer clays, and epoxy putties rather than clays. We'll call them putties because that's how they're known. And when I talk about classic traditional clays, you may be thinking like terracotta, water-based clays. That is basically earth, mud mixed with water. It dries out, you can fire it, you can add pigments to it. That is what's commonly used in pottery, but also in a lot of large-scale sculpt. You'll know that I came from a prop making background, and so I use that quite a lot for doing mask work or for making forms for animatronics, for prosthetic work, for scenic bits and pieces, for statues that needed to be cast, that kind of thing. But water-based is only one of those mediums. For the large-scale giant and Zordrak figures that I'm about to start, I'm going to be using Chavant. It's sometimes called, Chavant is a brand name. This is sometimes called monster clay. Plastilin is its more typical name, and this is it says sulfur free here. That's important because some of these clays have sulfur in, and that reacts badly with the silicon that you use to make the molds from. So sulfur free stuff is better. This is a wax based modelling clay, a plastilin, and so this is a solid block here, but when you warm it up in your hands it goes soft and malleable, and you can work it, and then as it cools down again it gets firm again, and you can use things at various stages, and you can brush lighter fluid or petroleum over the surface to smooth it out, and it's really nice for working in moderate scale stuff. It doesn't dry out like water-based clay, so you can come back to it, but you can work it at different temperatures depending on what effects you want, and you can heat tools up if you want them to cut easier through it. So it's a nice medium for working with sort of moderate scale, which is what I'm about to do. But it's not commonly used in the wargaming field because it doesn't dry totally rigid. You can't paint this and then use it on the table, it would get smushed. You can't put it in a vulcanizer, it would have to go into a soft silicon mould, take a resin cast of it, and then you can work with it. There is another type of clay called Plasticines. You might be familiar with plasticine as a children's plaything, and that's an oil based. So it's the same, it's a clay earth medium, but suspended in oil rather than in wax like plastilin, or water like a terracotta clay. Anyway, on to what are more frequent wargaming clays. The classic is green stuff here, and this one, I used to get this fairly cheaply from Green Stuff World, but if you look on eBay you'll see this listed as green stuff in hobbyist places and Kneadertite elsewhere, and if you buy it as Kneadertite, Knead, it's a lot cheaper. So I tend to buy this in a 36-inch ribbon, a big long ribbon, from looking up Kneadertite. But the last time that I had a look, which was a few weeks ago, it was really hard to find the same value stuff in 36-inch sections. You could buy it in smaller lengths, but the big rolls, which will last me maybe about 6 months, I couldn't find. But I managed to find one place that had it, was selling it as green stuff on the 36-inch roll. I don't know if that's a Brexit thing. It might well be a Brexit thing. That because Green Stuff World is in Europe and they may not be shipping stuff to the UK at the moment. So do look for Kneadertite. You probably won't need 36 inches, you'll probably want a smaller quantity. Look for Kneadertite if you can, it'll be a lot cheaper, but also sold as green stuff. And this comes in a ribbon. This is new, so this is nice and soft, but it goes a bit hard and sticky with age, so you do want to use this. And if I wasn't using it so regularly, I wouldn't buy 36 inches, I would buy it in the 8-inch strips and use it until I ran out, and then buy another one in, because fresher stuff is always better than buying old stuff. And you can buy this in 2 separate sticks, and you can also buy it with a gap down between them, because that area where the two meet, sometimes if it gets a bit old, that area in between can set, so you get this kind of hard rib down the middle, which you don't want to work with that. So it's better to get this fresh, and if you're going to be storing it for a long time, some people store it in the fridge or the freezer. You can do that, but only really if you're going to be keeping it for a long time. This will easily last 6 months without you having any problems with it. And this is a fairly traditional clay. I say traditional, I mean it's the clay that Games Workshop were using to sculpt in the 90s, so that's as far back as this goes really. And it took over from the earlier uses of actually plasticine. People used to sculpt war games figures in plasticine, and if you brush cyano glue, super glue on plasticine, it will harden up a bit, and you can mould from that. But also a lot of older war games companies used to be sculpted from solder, so they'd build up blobs of solder with a soldering iron and then carve that into shape, which is just incredible skill. So, but putty was a major step forwards, and Tom Mayer's chainmail was probably the big step forwards in the use of plumber's putty, because that's what this is designed for. This epoxy putty, this is designed for plumbing, for sealing pipes effectively. Not so much green stuff now, anyway. When it first came out, yes, but now green stuff is mostly sold as a hobby thing. But the more commonly, Milliput is sold still as a plumber's putty. Advantages of green stuff: it's really sticky, so you have no problem sticking it to an armature, sticking it to cured green stuff. It sets rigid. You can stick it in a vulcanizer under pressure, and you can make moulds for metal casting from it, no problem. Which means obviously you can stick it in silicone and make moulds for resin casting from it, no problem. You've got a work time, depending on the temperature, you've got a work time of about an hour and a half before it starts to harden, and then there are things that you can do at varying degrees of hardness, so you might want to wait until it gets a little bit less squishy to do fine details, and then harder still you can press final details in, and then when it's hard you can kind of carve it and shape it. It doesn't sand particularly well, it's still a bit plasticky, a bit flexible, but you can cut it and trim it and carve it with a scalpel. And a lot of the sculpting videos, tutorials you'll see are done with green stuff. It's kind of the go-to, but it's not the be-all and end-all. There are lots of other similar putties, Duro, brown stuff. There's a grey one as well. I don't know if it's called grey stuff. Don't know, but green stuff is what people will know. Big downsides of this: it has a kind of memory. So if you push detail, fine detail into it, as it cures, as it hardens, it'll sort of push that detail out. So you need to keep going back to it and adding the detail in again. It's also, as I said, very sticky, which is a disadvantage as well, because especially when it gets warm, it's very temperature dependent. If this gets really warm, it'll stick all over your fingers and pull and be all stretchy and gummy, and some people think it's a bit too much like chewing gum to be useful. So yeah, it has its, some people love it, some people hate it. It's a tool, okay? It's a optional material. I mentioned Milliput in passing. Milliput is also an epoxy plumber's putty, and Milliput, in terms of wargame sculpting, predates green stuff by a bit, but it's not so popular because it's quite granular. This is the superfine white stuff, and I'm using this just because I have this. The stuff that I usually use is the standard yellow grey putty. Absolutely fine, but it's quite granular. It will rub off on your fingers, and it's very difficult to get nice details pressed into the surface of it. It's quite difficult to work with, but some people again love it. What's really useful about Milliput is it's much harder when it cures. So you can make thin components that if you made them out of green stuff and put them in a vulcanizer, they'd get absolutely crushed and squished and distorted. They won't with Milliput, so I tend to use this for things like wings, for bases, for weapons. It's a lot more sandable and fileable than green stuff. You can get nice crisp edges in the way that you can't file and sand green stuff. And I tend to use a mix actually of both of these. So when I'm doing bases, I'll tend to use mostly Milliput with a little bit of green stuff in it, just to give it that kind of doughy quality rather than the granular quality. There are now some epoxy putties that are designed exclusively for wargame sculpting. Procreate is one of these. This is a two-part epoxy putty, same as Milliput, same as green stuff, but it is grey, which is good for seeing what you're actually doing. Sometimes the green of green stuff can be quite difficult on the eye to see what's actually going on. Because this stuff is grey, it's much easier to see the detail that you're actually putting in. I just noticed this is very fresh and this is very squishy. I had some of this that was a couple of years old, and it got really rock hard and difficult to use. So again, buy this fresh. And I noticed, I was going to comment that they had paper ends and cling film around the tubes, and that actually one of the things that I don't like about Procreate is that when you peel the paper off the top and you peel the cling film off the side, you end up wasting maybe a quarter of the stick in doing so. But actually this has a foil end and is wrapped in like greaseproof paper, so it's actually going to be a lot easier to peel the packing off. So that's good. They've listened, they've made some changes, and that's good news, because Procreate is actually one of my favourite clays to work with. It doesn't have the muscle memory that that green stuff has. So you press the detail into Procreate and it stays pressed in. I mentioned that the grey is easier on the eyes as well. This is also a lot harder when it cures than the green stuff. It's not quite as hard as Milliput, but you can definitely sand this and get crisper edges with a scalpel than you can on the green stuff. And what I tend to use when I'm sculpting is a 2-to-1 mix of 2 parts Procreate to 1 part green stuff. And the reason that I put a bit of green stuff in is because the downside to Procreate is that it's not as sticky, as gummy as green stuff, which is a bonus because it doesn't have the kind of memory that green stuff has, but it's also a disadvantage because it means it doesn't stick to armatures or to cured material quite as easy. So I just add a little bit of the green stuff to it to give it that bond. Now you will have seen when I've posted pictures of greens, that being the term for freshly sculpted miniatures, typically in the industry, when I've posted greens, they have recently tended to look green, and that is because I have been sculpting exclusively in green stuff for the last year because, as I mentioned, my Procreate was old and dried out. So I just have acquired some new Procreate. So from now on, you will probably see that my greens get noticeably more grey, and that's because I'm going to be using a bit more Procreate in with them. Now, all epoxy mediums can be mixed in varying ratios, as long as each one contains both the hardener and the other part of each of the epoxies in the ratios that they suggest. So with green stuff, it's about 2 parts yellow to 1 part blue. With the Milliput, it's about half and half, and the Procreate is actually a little bit flexible. You can get away with a 2-to-1 ratio on either side without any problem. But as long as you're mixing in about those ratios of each of the things that you're mixing into your mix, you can mix them as you like and they will still go off fine. Go off as in setting hard. Things to be aware of with the epoxy putties is that they can have a nasty effect on your hands. Okay, so just watch if you're using them a lot. They can cause irritation because of the chemicals that are in the putties, so they're not totally safe to work with. I do need to mention that. Now, the third kind of clay I haven't used very much, and that's polymer clays. Polymer clays are things like Fimo or Fimo. The classic one that you'll probably have come across is Sculpey. And there's a new one that's been designed in the last few years for wargame sculpting called Bees Putty, which is now very, very popular. These are all single part clays. You'll probably come across Fimo. I used to make jewellery and monsters and things out of it when I was a kid. And these are things that you then bake to harden them off, so you can keep on working them. They keep staying soft until you put them in an oven or a hot box or something to cure them, at which point they become hard, but not very hard. So polymer clays you can't put in a vulcanizer with regular black vulcanized rubber. They will get squished and deformed, so you need to be silicone molding and usually resin casting from polymer clays. A lot of people will make a resin master and then they'll put that in the vulcanizer and they'll make metal models from that. So it's not saying you can't make metal models from a polymer clay, but it won't withstand the vulcanizing process quite as well. And I've never really worked sort of professionally miniature wise with any of these, so I don't have a lot to say on them, and that's largely because I prefer to get a bit sculpted, get it right, add a next bit to it, add a next bit into it. I've tried working with clays that stay rubbery and soft, and I know you can bake at intervals if you want to, but quite honestly, the epoxy stuff works for what I want, so that's what I stick with, what I know. So if you want to play with polymer clays, a lot of people think they're great. A lot of very, very good sculptors use them, so maybe it's worth looking into them, but other people can advise you on those. One thing that I will say is that Bees Putty particularly, I know that Kev White mixes a tiny bit of Bees Putty in with his green stuff. And that makes it kind of softer and removes that muscle memory so that you can shape it and get nice sharp edges a lot easier. But it is a bit of a risky business because then you've got a bit of uncured material floating around in your model that's going to go into a vulcanizer. He puts his stuff always into silicone molds and resin masters them, so there's no danger there. But if you are going to put stuff in the vulcanizer, just be a bit careful if you're going to add a little bit of polymer clay into your mix. Add a very, very small amount and maybe bake it first. Just bake the whole figure once it's cured and it seems set. Just give it a quick blast in the oven to make sure. So that's the sculpting mediums. I hope that's been useful, and next week maybe we'll start having a look at some more sculpting stuff. So again, if there's stuff that you want me to look at particularly, give me a shout, let me know. And if you've got any experience working with polymer clays and you would like to have a chat about that, I'd love to feature a bit of a video on polymer clays, so perhaps we could have a live chat. Perhaps we could have a beverage and a bake. Good, we haven't done that for a while, so perhaps we could have one of those over if that's your preferred sculpting medium. That's all for now. Take care, and I shall see you next week.